a bit about the monitoring program and how it's divided into different categories. And then I'll take you through some of the results from last year in particular. Before we get started, there are 2 other webinars that I've done over the last couple of years that are both online, and they talk a little bit more about baseline findings. That's something I'm not going to talk about an awful lot today. So if that's something you're interested in, have a look online. They're on our webpage and also on YouTube. So you're more than welcome to just watch them back if you like. Seen a few familiar faces popping up, some of my old volunteers. It's really lovely to see you. So yeah, this is the project area for those of you who have never been on site or who have never seen this map. This is all of it, just under 600 hectares. This grey band here is Thornden Woods Road. And the project area is divided into 3 main treatments. So we've got this blob here to the west of the road, which is our control area. That has no grazing animals in it at all. And then everything east of the road is divided into the bison area, which is this lighter green color, and the proxy area, which is the darker green east of the road. Sometimes we refer to that as grazing, sometimes we call it livestock. So if you hear any of those 3 words, they all mean the same thing. So the bison area is made up of bison, Iron Age pigs, and exmoor ponies. And the livestock areas is made up of longhorn cattle in place of the bison, again, alongside Iron Age pigs and exmoor ponies. And we've adopted this before-after control impact study design, which is really lovely from a more scientific point of view, and particularly from my point of view as the monitoring person, because not only can we see what changes over time and how that changes, we can also directly compare the impact of the bison through their very unique ecology and behavior with a similarly large herbivore like the longhorn cattle, and then we can compare both of those to the control area that has no grazing animals in it whatsoever and will benefit from a more traditional woodland management approach. Looking at this map, actually, I'd quite talk about a few caveats when it comes to monitoring, when it comes to data, projects like this. So one of the first things that pops into my head are these hourglass shapes here. I hope you can see my cursor. They are going to be our bison bridges. So they will be connecting all of the 5 bison areas with one another so that the animals in those compartments can move freely whenever they wish to do that. Those bridges haven't been built yet. So that means that the bison currently are only in this compartment here in the southeast, and they have been in there since they arrived. So whenever I refer to data from the bison area, that is still all of those compartments, because that is what the bison area is going to be in the long run. However, they've only been in one of those compartments. And to make things a little bit more complicated, because that's what we like to do, this bison area here in the northwest currently contains our Iron Age pigs. And actually at the moment, it also has the longhorn cattle in it. They've been moving in and out of that area. Currently they're in there. And so then the ponies are moving freely through the rest of the woodland, including all of the other bison areas. So the bison treatment currently is not what it's going to be in the future. And so any impact that we can see in that area isn't necessarily down to the bison, because we're talking about all of those 5 areas, not just the one compartment that the bison are in. I hope that makes sense. Obviously, with a project like this, it's so big. We do run into brick walls here and there. Sorry. And there's always lots of hoops to jump through and hurdles to jump over. And these are just some of them. So stuff like that is unfortunately impacting the monitoring in the long run. But this is just something that we need to keep in mind when we're looking at data, when we're analyzing it, interpreting it, and we need to keep in mind that these things happen. And when it comes to report writing or explaining data, that's just something that needs to be explained. So we're not attributing change that we're seeing on site to something that hasn't caused that change. sorry. Right, the monitoring program is rather large. It is probably the largest monitoring program for any wilding project in the UK. Our main objective is to evaluate how reinstating a more naturalistic grazing regime into this ecosystem can drive landscape scale ecological processes and integrity. And we've divided it into 4 main categories. The first one is habitat structure and vegetation dynamics, which, as the name suggests, sort of incorporates all of your vegetation and habitat related surveys. We're looking at plant communities, composition, heterogeneity when it comes to structures, things like natural regeneration, age types of plants, all that kind of thing. Second category is biodiversity and bioabundance, which sort of covers your more generic species surveys that you would think of. So under that falls species richness, diversity, and abundance. Things like trophic complexity and also flagship species. Then category 3 is natural processes, and that's the ones that have already been on site and also the ones that we're introducing to site. So we're looking at collaring the animals, for instance, and looking at where they're moving. We're looking at underrepresented niches, and we're looking at, are we actually reducing human impact whilst at the same time, ideally increasing biodiversity. And then category 4 is ecosystem services and natural capital. And that's things like soil health, soil carbon, pollination. All of those things tend to come out of other bits and pieces of survey work. That kind of just gives you a bit of a high-level overview, but I think it becomes aware quite quickly that there's a lot of work involved, that the monitoring program is really large. And so we couldn't do that ourselves. A lot of the work is sourced in-house. We also do some of it through contractors. I have an army of wonderful volunteers who help us with various parts of the monitoring program. And we're also working with local ecology groups like Crag, Kent Mammal Group, and Butterfly Conservation, who again help us with bits and pieces of the monitoring program. And then there's a lot of collaborative work going on between us and academic research partners and other research institutes, like the Natural History Museum, the University of Kent, who all have specific interests in specific parts of the monitoring program. And this really is just a list of examples of the people we work with. It's actually quite a lot longer than that. And as I'm sure you can imagine, as the project got a little bit more traction and publicity, people started to reach out to us more and more and want to get involved. So category 1, under that we have the vegetation monitoring, which I do every summer across 140 monitoring points. They're each 300 square meters big, and I record pretty much any vegetation related data you could think of in each of those points. So things like species diversity and abundance, of course, but also things like nectar sources, bramble cover, number of seedlings, saplings, canopy trees, the size of those trees, the deadwood volume, you name it. So that means I'm basically living in the undergrowth for the better part of 3 months over the summer. Then we also do plant community mapping. That is national vegetation classification surveys. And that's a system of classifying natural habitat types according to the vegetation they contain. So it's very much based on woodland communities. We've done that as part of the baseline, and we're going to redo that in 2026. So I won't be speaking about that today. We're also doing normalized difference vegetation index. That is done through remote sensing and through our drone work. Sometimes that's called greenness index as well. And it's a widely used metric for quantifying the health and the density of vegetation using sensor data. And using the drones, we're also doing 3D vegetation modeling, which is really lovely because it's a nice tool to compare what that vegetation looks like and how that changes over time. And it's also a really lovely sort of engagement piece to show the public. Okay, Vegetation monitoring is what I'm going to start with. I've left this page blank because I'll actually take you out of the presentation and into a bit of a web app. But before I do that, this is really a reminder to myself to point out a few more things before we actually start going into the data. So as I've mentioned, I won't be going much into baseline. If you'd like to know a bit more about that, there's lots of information online on our monitoring webpage. I'm also not going to go through each and every survey this time. I did that for the webinar last year, and I feel like I may have scrambled people's brains a little bit. So I've sort of cherry picked this year, the bits and pieces that are a little bit more interesting, so that hopefully I'm not overloading you with information. And the other thing that's important is that this is the first year of monitoring with the grazers on site, which is exciting. But as I'm sure you can imagine, within that first year, nothing much has changed. So by the time we took all the data last summer, the animals had only been there for 10 months or so. And even though they make visible changes on site, and I'll talk a little bit more about that, by the time that actually trickles down to the data level, and we do see that increased biodiversity and bioabundance that we're hoping for, I would imagine we're talking about a good 5, if not 10 years worth of data. So, you know, just something to keep in mind. And I'm not going to show you this just yet. Disconnected from server, well, that's unfortunate. So this is an interactive web map. I hope you can all see that. And it's something that we're going to include in our 3-year report. I'm also hoping to integrate that into our monitoring webpage so that people can actually go online and click their way through whatever they're interested in. It's really lovely to be able to just have these graphs pop up and choose what it is exactly you want to see and what it is you want to have a look at. So what we're looking at here is the species richness in the bison treatment in 2023. So all these species you can see in a circle here are the plants that have been found within the bison monitoring points last year. And then these blocks of color here indicate how abundant they were. So they go from rare in yellow all the way to dominant in, what is that, dark purple, dark blue? And you can see the only plants that were dominant was birch and bramble. And then going into abundant, we had sweet chestnut, bit of oak. Going into frequent, there's some holly, honeysuckle, and hazel. And then other than that, all the other species have been a lot less abundant. So interestingly now, if I go back in time and I look at 2022, you might notice it's not an awful lot changing, both in terms of the amount of species and also in terms of abundance. And then if I go back into our baseline year, again, there's not an awful lot of change. There will always be some fluctuations, but overall, this is very similar to last year's data. And that is pretty much what I would have expected to happen. Had there been a huge amount of change between one year and another, I would have thought that something's going on there. This is what I thought would come out. However, if we're going into our proxy area or livestock area, you might see, if it loads, yay, that the diversity in there is much higher. So you have a whole heap more plants in the proxy area than the bison area. And again, going through time, that doesn't really change. It pretty much stays the same. So it becomes obvious very quickly that time hasn't made any difference yet. There isn't really any change between 2021 and 2023. There is, however, quite a large difference between the proxy area and the bison area. So that's going to be something that's going to be super interesting to watch over time. Is the bison area going to pick up? Is it going to overtake proxy? Is the diversity maybe decreasing in the proxy area? What's going to happen? So that will be really exciting to watch over the next 5 years. And if I can figure out how to make this go away, probably not. Louise, any ideas? Ah, I can move it. Wonderful. Going into the next web app, this is very similar. And again, hopefully something that will be available online. Come on. So if we're sticking with species richness, which is the same thing we've just looked at with the circular plot. So this time I've got all 3 years next to one another. So you can see the whole project area. Blue is control, orange is bison, green is livestock. The red crosses mean that I haven't been able to access that particular monitoring point, usually because it's completely overgrown and I would need a machete to go in there, which kind of defeats the purpose. But looking down here, those lines are your median lines of the amount of plants that we found in each treatment in each year. And if I was to draw a straight line through all of these median lines, it would be a straight line. So again, this just shows us that diversity really has stayed the same and there hasn't been an awful lot of change between the years. If I show you something else, I'm going to pick the number of seedlings. So this is the number of tree seedlings in each year, in each treatment. And whilst the control has stayed fairly similar from one year to another, the one thing that popped out to me straight away was that the bison area had increased and the proxy area had increased over the last year. Now, this is one of those really lovely examples where data can be interpreted in all kinds of ways, if you'd like, because someone might look at this and say, oh, so the grazers have increased the numbers of seedlings, and that's what that data tells them. Whereas actually, I know we had a mast year last year, and every time I was out, I found an absolute carpet of oak seedlings because we had loads and loads and loads of acorns the autumn before. So that's the only reason why the seedlings have gone up. Every time I went out, I found thousands, and that's probably what some of these outliers are here. Thousands of oak seedlings in some of those monitoring points. And that obviously has an impact on what the data is going to look like when it's being spit out at the end. So those natural fluctuations are very much something that needs to be taken into consideration. And I will be speaking about that with other examples later on as well. And you know, obviously in nature, things do fluctuate, and particularly with things that are a little bit more sensitive, like invertebrates, those natural fluctuations do happen on an annual basis, and they can be quite drastic. So just another thing to keep in mind. Another thing I was going to show you on here is the deadwood count. So I do record the deadwood volume. This particular one is for standing deadwood in the large category, which means that it has to be longer than a meter and wider than 30 centimeters diameter. And this again popped out straight away, and I looked at it and I thought, that's a bit weird. I don't think we've had that much more deadwood last year than we did the 2 years before. And I then realized that we changed the survey methodology after 2022. Until then, I'd been recording every piece of deadwood, estimating its length and diameter, which took a crazy amount of time. So I spoke with our data people and we changed it to put the deadwood into 3 size categories, one of them being large, which really speeds up my recording on site and made a huge difference and really helped me. So we then had to put the previous 2 years into those size categories. And that means that the data looks a little bit funny. And again, that's just one of those things that happen. Survey methodologies do get adjusted as you go because you figure out, XYZ doesn't work and you need to change things. And again, this is just something that when it comes to report writing or to explaining data needs to be explained and needs to be mentioned so that it's not interpreted in a wrong way or in any other way than it should be. Right, going back into my presentation. I'm moving straight into, it's a bit in the way, isn't it? Into biodiversity and bioabundance. So within that, we have our standardized invertebrate surveys. They are being done by a contractor called Graham Lyons. Now, for those of you who've never heard of Graham Lyons, go check him out. Even if you have no interest in invertebrates, he's brilliant. He writes a really, really good blog. And he also has this thing on Facebook called Tiny Recorder. If you've never seen that, give it a Google. He goes out with this little Lego figure called Tiny, and Tiny meets all the insects wherever he's doing a survey. And Graham then writes these stories of Tiny's adventures. And it's a really lovely, engaging, interactive tool. Again, not just for people interested in invertebrates, but if you have 5 spare minutes, go and check out Tiny Recorder. I'm drifting. Number 2 is botanical richness, diversity, and abundance. That comes out of the vegetation surveys. We're also doing breeding birds and lesser spotted woodpecker surveys. That was part of the baseline and will be repeated in 2026, so nothing to update at this point. UK BMS are our butterfly surveys, and I will talk about that a little bit in a moment. We're looking at European protected species with the help of local ecology groups. So CRAG, Kent Reptile and Amphibian Group help us with the reptile monitoring on site. Kent Mammal Group help us with dormouse monitoring. And we also have a volunteer who's deployed audio moths to look at bat monitoring. And we're also working with the University of Sussex, who have deployed audio moths to look at the whole soundscape. So not just bats or birds, they're even looking at the noise that vegetation makes and how that changes over time. So quite an interesting bit of research there. Bioabundance is done through invertebrate abundance, and I'll be talking about that quite a bit in a moment. And then trophic complexity comes out of all sorts of other surveys. So standardized invertebrate surveys, this was done as part of the baseline and won't be repeated until 2026. And it's the only bit of baseline information I'm going to mention today, just because it was probably the most interesting find we had as part of the baseline monitoring. And we were all super excited when the report came to us and we saw what Graham had actually found. So in the map, you can see his survey points. I think he had 8 in each treatment. And then those 4 species on the right were some of the more exciting finds. So the top left is Pistius truncatus, which is a spider species that was last seen in the UK 20 years ago. Top right is Vulcanaria mitrata, which was also last seen in the UK in 2004. So again, nearly 20 years by the time it was found. Bottom left is a rare Anthrabbit weevil, so a fungus beetle, that hasn't actually been seen in the UK since 1988. So that was super exciting. And then Lagria trepis in the bottom right is a beetle that was declared as regionally extinct, but actually doesn't seem very scarce in the Blean and seems to be making a bit of a comeback in the southeast. And my volunteers who've been going through some of the invertebrates we find in our traps, and again, I'll talk a bit more about that in a moment, have found quite a few of those, particularly over the 2023 data. So they really do seem to be around, and they're not scarce anymore at all, which is lovely to see. Butterflies. So on the map, you can see the 5 butterfly transects that we have in the Blean. They're being walked on a weekly basis over the course of several months from April to September, depending on the weather. And the table on the right just shows you the data from last year. So you can see we had 4,881 butterflies altogether, which is a nice number. And that's gone up from 2021 when we had 3,351. So that's nice to see. But again, keep in mind, invertebrates in particular do fluctuate from year to year. So that doesn't really tell us an awful lot. But either way, it's nice to see an increase in abundance for whatever reason. And this is one of the outputs we get from data analysis. So this is what's called a box plot and whiskers. If you've never seen this before, the boxes are called boxes, and they contain 50% of your data. And then these long lines going up and down are called your whiskers, and they extend to the maximum data and the minimum data. Sometimes there's data points up here, which are called outliers, and they're just kind of like those extreme data points, which seem a bit odd, but sometimes just happen. And then the thick line in the middle is your median. So this graph shows you the butterfly species richness in all 3 treatments over the course of the 3 years. So you can immediately see the bison area hasn't really changed an awful lot. Control has gone a little bit up and down. Proxy has kind of stayed the same, but what's obvious at the same time is that in the proxy area, the species richness is much higher than in the control and the bison area. And those lines up here tell you the same thing. So when you see that, it means there is a statistically significant difference between wherever those lines end. So there's a statistically significant difference between proxy and bison, and also between proxy and control. So again, that's just going to be really interesting to observe over the next few years. How is that going to change? Is that going to decrease? Are the other areas going to increase? Maybe nothing changes at all, but this is a nice beginning point, so to speak. Dormice. The map in the top right corner shows you our dormouse survey location. So we have 20 nest boxes in a survey area in the control here. This is proxy, and this up here is your bison area. In 2021, which is when the boxes were first deployed, we had 3 nests in the bison area and 1 in the control area. Then surveys in 2022 came back with 2 dormice in May, 1 in July, 2 in August, 4 in September, all in the bison area. And then in 2023, we went up to 1 adult in May, another adult in June with 5 grey eyes open. So that's a life stage of dormice. When they're first born, they're called pinks because they're pink. Then they go to grey eyes closed, grey eyes open, juvenile, adult. So then in July, we had 2 adults and 2 juveniles, 2 adults and 2 grey eyes open in August, another 2 adults, 4 grey eyes open in September, and 2 adults and 3 juveniles in October, all found in the bison area, that's supposed to say. So we went from nests only to 9 dormice to 26 dormice. And again, this is one of those examples where, you could look at the data and say, oh, wonderful, the dormouse abundance has increased. Well, it probably hasn't, because dormice are known to take a long time to get used to nest boxes. So it's very common that once nest boxes are deployed, you're looking at quite a few years before they even start using them, making their nests in them, using them to have their young. So I would imagine that those 26 dormice we had last year were also around in 2021 and just didn't use the nest boxes. But either way, lovely to see that they're there. And at this point, a big shout out to Kent Mammal Group, who help us with monitoring the dormice. It's quite a lot of work doing that every month. 20 boxes in each treatment is a lot to get around. So we're very grateful to have them on board. And actually the same thing goes for Crag, who help us with the reptile monitoring, which is also a hell of a lot of work. There's a lot of transects, a lot of reptile mets that need to be looked under and checked every week. So we certainly couldn't do it without the help of all those volunteers and all the groups who are involved. So again, the map in the top right corner shows you the reptile survey locations. So you've got 2 in the control. Then this is your bison area this time, because the bison area sort of goes along here. And this is proxy. And looking at the little table, there isn't an awful lot that stands out. The control area has kind of gone up in slowworm numbers, but then gone down in lizard numbers. So that might just be another one of those natural fluctuations. the proxy area has definitely gone down in slow worm numbers, and I would imagine that's because we were doing quite a lot of prep work for the grazers to arrive. So there was a lot of oak thinning going on still, a lot of conifer thinning. It's quite a lot of heavy machinery, woodland management type thing that we're now moving away from, that could well have disturbed them. Interesting to me is the bison area where slow worm numbers and lizard numbers and grass snake numbers have gone up. Because as you might remember, this bison area here currently contains our Iron Age pigs. And I was really, really interested to see what the impact would be and what happens to reptiles with the pigs present. And so far, so good. I'm not saying that this impact is due to the pigs, but there certainly hasn't been a negative impact, which is nice to see. And either way, again, it's lovely to see all these species going up in abundance for whatever reason that might be. Moving on to invertebrate abundance. Now, you can see the trap here. That's a SLAM trap, which stands for sea, land, air, malaise trap. And it works by invertebrates flying into those nets that you can see. Their instinct is then to go up, which is where they get trapped in their little dome, and they end up in a sample bottle full of propylene glycol, which preserves them. I then service them every month, and then I have a bunch of lovely volunteers who go through those sample bottles over the winter using microscopes, and they take those samples to order rather than species. So we don't want diversity from this particular survey, we want abundance. So by taking them to order, it will then tell us how many flies, how many bugs, how many beetles. The picture in the bottom is a snake fly, which is one of the more exciting finds we tend to have. And actually, if you look at it from the top, the head very much looks like a snake. And so then looking at the graph, you can see invertebrates per day, again in a box plot, by habitat type. So I have 5 traps up in each treatment, and per treatment, there's 1 in each habitat type: coppice, high forest, native region, open, and plantation. And then the dots are your invertebrate numbers per day, and they're colored by treatment. So this is quite in depth. Not going too far into detail, the one thing that stands out immediately is native region, right? So numbers in native region have been a lot higher than in all of the other habitat types. And again, that's what these lines tell us up here, not that we need them because it's obvious anyway, but native region numbers have been statistically significantly different from all the other habitat types. And looking at a similar box plot, this time invertebrates per day per treatment. So we've got our control, our bison, our proxy, and then the different colors this time stand for different habitat types. Again, it becomes obvious that one of them sort of stands out and seems much higher than the others, and that's the control, so the area that doesn't have any grazers in it at the moment. That to me is exciting because I'm curious to see if the bison and the proxy are going to pick up. Is that going to increase over the next few years? Again, those lines up here just indicate that statistic difference. The other thing that's quite obvious to see is we also have a comparison here between 2021 and 2022. And unfortunately, it's very obvious that there's quite a significant decline in numbers through all 3 treatment areas. Again, with invertebrates, we need to keep in mind that they tend to fluctuate naturally, particularly on a year-by-year basis. And looking at 2 years worth of data really isn't a lot. Our volunteers have just finished going through the 2023 bottles, so that data hasn't been included. But I'm pretty sure looking at the numbers and remembering what the bottles looked like, this is very much going to continue. And I think 2023 is somewhere similar to 2022, if not even a bit lower. But that's actually something that we're seeing in other projects as well. Invertebrate numbers do decline. That's probably not a secret. We're seeing that all across the country. And it might well be climate change and the fact that we've had some really, really warm summers. There's a couple of pictures there of my ever so lovely group of volunteers who come in every Wednesday over the winter and have been doing so for the last 3 years, looking at microscopes, hours and hours at a time, looking at the tiniest invertebrates and taking them to order level. And it's been a real joy for me to spend my Wednesdays with them. So big shout out to my invertebrate volunteer group. I know some of you are here and you know who you are. Moving on to category 3, natural processes. So under that, we have our heath fritillary butterflies. They are flagship species of the Blean and are actually quite abundant in that area, even though numbers tend to be very low in other parts of the country. They're also a reason the site is designated a SSSI4, so we're monitoring them and their food plants very closely. Baseline grazing and browsing pressure from wild herbivores, that's deer. So as the name says, we did that as part of the baseline surveys. I won't be talking about that. If you want more information, it is available online. Spatial mapping of the use and influencing of the introduced large herbivores and population dynamics of the herbivores. And last but not least, reducing human influence versus biodiversity uplift. Now, that I won't be talking because I've been lazy. And that particular point is at the very bottom of my priority list because it is so hard to draw a line and actually find a way to start this. So ideally, what we want to see with reducing human influence versus biodiversity uplift is exactly that. We'll be able to demonstrate that we put less human hours in to do this traditional woodland management using machinery, using chainsaws, and we're letting the ecosystem engineers be the nature-based solutions that we need them to be. We let them do the work for us. And at the same time, we see biodiversity increase. Now that sounds wonderful on paper, and I'm sure there's a way to demonstrate that. But with a big project like this, I'm sure you can imagine there's a lot of manpower going into it away from woodland management. So our communications team, our engagement team, our monitoring team, all of that needs to be taken into consideration as well. So I've really struggled to wrap my head around all of that. It is part of the monitoring program and it will get some attention at some point, not just yet. So heath fritillary, this is a map from 2021 and it sort of shows you the cowweed abundance in orange. So the whole project area has been covered in squares and every square has had volunteers go through them and assign them an abundance for common cowweed, which is one of the heath fritillary food plants, but also for ripwort plantain, which is the other food plant. So even where you don't see a square that has been surveyed, it just means there's been no food plants. So the darker the orange, the higher the amount of common cowweed. And then the black circles show you the heath fritillary counts. So the bigger the circle, the more heath frits were there. And it's quite obvious that they do like to be where their food plants are. So you can see where those really big circles are. We did have a lot of common cowweed. And actually in the areas where there's heath fritillaries but no common cowweed, that tends to be areas where there's ripwort plantain instead. And I've just pulled this out as a comparison for food plant abundance over the last 3 years. You can see there's been a bit of a dip in volunteer activity in 2022, and we didn't actually manage to survey this gray area here, but then it picked up again last year and we pretty much got the whole survey area covered other than a few areas that were inaccessible. And looking at the cowweed abundance, which is kind of like this yellow-green color, there were some hotspots in 2021 that haven't really popped up again last year, but then there's other areas and they are very faintly colored, but there's quite a few areas of blue up here that weren't really there in 2021. So it looks like we've lost some and we've gained some, and overall the cowweed abundance is very similar. Unfortunately, Butterfly Conservation, who do the heath fritillary counts, have had quite a drop in volunteer activity. So all of these lovely counts that we had in 2021, we didn't have over the past 2 years. I think last year we only had 4 counts. That is such a low number, it doesn't even show up on this map. That doesn't mean the heath fritillaries aren't there. You may have seen when I showed the butterfly table that actually heath fritillary numbers are still super high. It's just the particular survey that relates to these maps doesn't show them, unfortunately, but they are buzzing around. And if you are in the Blean going for a walk, if you just walk along some of the more open rides, in the summer, you will be surrounded by swarms of heath fritillary, which is rather lovely. Spatial mapping. I can't even read that now. It's in the way again. Spatial mapping of use and influencing of introduced large herbivores. Now, rather than showing you a boring static map, I thought I'd take you into the life whereabouts of our bison. So all of our animals are GPS collared, except for the pigs. The livestock, the longhorn cattle are, the bison are, and the ponies are. If you know of a way to collar a pig, please let me know. We haven't figured one out yet. Not each and every animal is collared, but there are a couple at least per herd, and they tend to stay together, so we are able to figure out their whereabouts. So this is the bison whereabouts for the last month. I hope you can all see that. And you can see they really get around. They do make use of their whole area. The lovely thing about this is that I can change the length here. I can look at where they've been over the last 2 months. This is definitely not an actual data point. I promise you they have not left their compartment, in case anyone is going to ask that question at the end. I can also take that down to just today. It usually takes a little while to get there. So you can see they've done a little loop around their corral and then probably went for a little drink down here, did a little loop, haven't moved an awful lot today. Taking that back to the last month, the other lovely thing we can do is create heat maps. It's kind of obvious already from, come on. Of course, there we go. So this really shows you which areas they frequent most, which areas they like using. So again, this is the corral here. I know they have a dust bathing site up here. They have a pond they like drinking from down here. And so it becomes very obvious which areas they like using, which areas they don't like using. And obviously that's nice for our rangers. That's nice for me as well. If we do need to go into their area, we immediately know where they are and where we can and can't go. But also from a data analysis point of view, if we do witness change over time, if we monitor, I don't know, say a lot of open areas, a lot of nectar sources all of a sudden, we can then have a look at this map. We can overlay our vegetation data with this map and actually figure out, have they been in that area? Have they created that change? And then we can really attribute any change that we find in other bits and pieces of data to the bison whereabouts and where they like it and where they don't. So I wonder if, I hope you have all received some interesting information from this webinar. I appreciate it is not crazy exciting, but again, that's because we only have 1 year worth of data, and there was never going to be a huge change within that 1 year. As I said before, it is really obvious and really visible that the bison are making a difference on site, and it becomes super obvious to me when I go in and I do my vegetation monitoring. And I remember some of those points I just wasn't able to get to in the first year. It was such thick, dense forest. It took me hours to get from one point to another. And now all of a sudden I can do that same walk in minutes because they've really opened up that area so much. They love going in one straight line, and where the longhorn cattle like to stick to already existing paths, the bison will just go through anything that's in their way. They don't care, and they take it down with them. Unless it's an anthill. They don't like that. So they will approach the anthill all the way to the edge, then they use it as a roundabout, they go around to the other side, and then they continue their straight line. But they do create a lot of open habitat. They do allow more sunlight to come to the woodland floor. They're debarking the trees. They're rubbing up against the trees, creating a lot of standing deadwood. And they create these lovely dust bathing sites, which are wonderful for invertebrates, burrowing invertebrates and reptiles. So I just thought I'd show you this, which is female one of the younger bison females we have on site, and she's about to have a little snack. So they really stick their teeth underneath the bark and then start to pull back, so the whole length of bark just peels off the tree. And she really only needs to do that 3 or 4 times on that tree, and then it's completely debarked and it will become standing deadwood, which again is fantastic for invertebrates, for other mammals, for birds. So I just wanted to get that in. And then last but not least, I'll leave you with our little coffee. Again, if you'd like any more information on anything in particular, we put all of our data, all of our reports on our monitoring webpage, which you can find under kentwildlifetrust.org.uk/Blean monitoring. And that gets updated as we go. If you have any specific questions that you feel like aren't answered there, or if you would like any specific piece of data, you can always email us as well on blean@wilderkent.org.uk. And that leaves me with nothing but to ask you if you have any questions.
Anyone wants to put anything into the chat, you can, or I think you can raise your hand as well. So if you've got the reactions button, you should be able to raise your hand, and then we can unmute you and you can ask Kora any questions if you'd like to. Oh, Peter, I just happened to have scrolled past you on my screen. Did you want to ask a question?
Thank you. Sorry, I didn't use the,
yeah, go ahead.
Didn't use the technology. Absolutely fascinating. Thank you so much, Kora.
Really. Oh, you're welcome.
I'm just wondering, I may have missed this in a previous webinar, but do you have a kind of hypothesis for what the bison are going to do? Or is this just open-ended, let's just see what happens?
It is the latter. So the whole idea around the monitoring program is that we don't really know what's going to happen, and we want to evidence exactly what it is they're going to do. This is the first of its kind in this country, and so it's really important for us to collect as much data and evidence exactly what they're doing. But you know, as much as we'd like to think they will increase biodiversity and abundance, that is our main aim, and we think they're going to do that because we know the behaviors they have, like the dust bathing and the bark stripping. We don't know, so there is no hypothesis. There's nothing we're aiming for. We're just gonna let them do their thing and evidence that as best as we can.
Great, thank you. And then just, if I may, a sort of follow-up question.
Sure.
A lot of bison have been around in other parts of Europe and the United States elsewhere. Do we have a hint from those places as to whether they're likely to increase biodiversity?
As far as I'm aware, so the American bison are a different species. As far as I'm aware, in Europe, there isn't, specifically in the projects that we're in touch with in the Netherlands, there isn't an awful lot of monitoring going on. Definitely not as to the same level and the same detail we do. So I don't think there's a lot of evidence coming from European countries.
Okay. Thank you.
Tom, would you like to go?
Sure. I'm sure it's mentioned somewhere, but what is the carrying capacity for bison at the Blean Project? Presumably, you know, the herd is quite small currently, but as the years go on, the herd will grow to quite a notable size, and with that, the potential for those processes and dynamics and disturbances to increase across the site.
Yeah, absolutely. And actually the herd has grown a bit quicker than we thought it would. I think, I don't want to say anything wrong, there's probably a ranger question, but I think the capacity is at the moment set at about, oh, Christina's here, you might be able to answer that better. I think it's 18.
Yeah, so yeah, it's a really good question. And again, it's something where we have ideas in mind, but we want to stay open about it. Obviously, in the part right now, they've only had a really small area, that a calf that was born out of season. So there are so many things that influence that we had, for example, to feed, which we don't want to do. We want to kind of respect the natural carrying capacity, so we don't have to feed. Once all the bridges are in and they have the whole area, we'll just have to see how they go on. And also, the difficulty is always that there's such a difference in carrying capacity between summer and winter. So with all of our other livestock, it's very easy to manage that because we can swap them between sites. So we can kind of like keep a higher average, whereas on this project, we'll have to work with the lower number, which is the winter number, like how many bison can survive in the winter. It is normal for the bison to like gain a lot of weight and then lose a lot of weight in the winter, and that is something that we're fine with and happy with, but obviously we need to make sure that their welfare doesn't suffer, because we put them in the area. If they were in the complete wild, they could just move on. They don't have that, so we kind of have the moral obligation to look after them a bit better. That doesn't really answer your question with a number, because we can't really answer that question yet. At the minute we have 6 individuals, and we'll see how we get on when they get out into the bigger area. Yes, the plan is to breed, increase the number. The plan is also to keep breeding, not just to increase the population on our site, but also because we're part of the breeding program. And so we want to start exchanging individuals and helping the population grow in Europe overall to help that species come back. Yeah.
Brilliant. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Thanks, Christina. And there's a couple of questions just come up in the chat as well, which might be a combined answer needed. So have you had to do anything about deer management is the first one?
No, we haven't. We're quite lucky with West Blean and Thornden Woods. There isn't a lot of deer in that area. In fact, the wild herbivore baseline survey that I was talking about came back with, I think it was only 1 or 2 deer. That was done based on pellet numbers we found across the site. So yeah, deer management isn't really a thing we need to worry about. And actually, we've had people from Forestry England come down last year at some point, and they were absolutely amazed to see a proper woodland understory. They said they hadn't seen that in years because everywhere they go, the deer pressure is just way too high. But lucky for us, that isn't really a problem we need to worry about.
Lovely. And possibly final one, we could just squeeze this one in. So aside from locating the bison, do you also track their behaviour? So I guess any of the other behaviours that we're maybe keeping an eye on?
That might be one for you, Christina.
Yes, probably. So we do try to get sight on them at least once a day, and we do take notes of them. So they obviously have like some sort of a record that has anything to do with like major things in health, and we kind of track like things that happen to them from our point of view. But we also use that system, for example, with the calf. So we make a note when we see it, is it still suckling? Is it not suckling anymore? We make notes of changes in behavior in terms of their social dynamics. So for example, we did see a short while ago, my colleagues did, how the bull pushed a matriarch off their foot. It's like unheard of, you know. So those sort of like special behaviors we make note of. And it's been really interesting to see how the 2 females who were like super shy when they came first round, how they're really coming through and getting bolder, and how the dynamic is shifting, because the matriarch obviously is also getting on, she's getting older. And so we already like taken our bets, like who's gonna follow her in that role. So yes, we make notes of that because it's interesting and it's also a good piece of data, but also for us and for a safety point of view, because we have to interact with them to a certain extent for various reasons. So for us, it's really important also to know like what their behavior is like and how it is to be around them. So yeah, we do that.
That's great, thank you. So we are getting very close to 7 o'clock now. So thank you all for coming. Thank you very much, Christina, for your help with the questions there, and also obviously to Kora for that fascinating presentation. I hope you all found it really interesting. And we will be having more throughout the year and ongoing years, so keep an eye out and we'll be keeping you all updated. But yeah, thank you very much for coming.
Thank you.